I should have never called him. Not at 3 a.m., not with mascara running down my face like war paint, and definitely not while standing in my destroyed apartment with my cheek still burning from where Marcus hit me hard enough that I tasted copper on my tongue and saw stars exploding behind my eyelids like some cruel fireworks display celebrating my stupidity for staying this long. But Dante Volkov's card had been burning a hole in my pocket for 3 months, ever since that night at the charity gala when he'd looked at me like I was something precious instead of disposable. Like I was a masterpiece hanging in the gallery instead of just the girl who pointed wealthy collectors toward the art they should buy. And I'd felt seen in a way that terrified me because men like him, dangerous, powerful, wrapped in expensive Italian suits that probably cost more than my yearly salary, didn't look at women like me unless they wanted something. When his voice answered after just 2 rings, rough, with sleep but instantly alert in that way that suggested he was a man accustomed to midnight emergencies and crisis management, I broke completely, shattered into 1,000 pieces like the vintage mirror Marcus had thrown my jewelry box into an hour ago. And I sobbed into the phone about my boyfriend's rage that had been building for months, like a storm I kept pretending wasn't coming. About the bruises I could hide under makeup and strategic clothing choices and lies about being clumsy. About the fear that lived in my bones and made me flinch at sudden movements and raised voices, and the particular way Marcus's jaw would tighten before he exploded. What I didn't know, what I couldn't possibly have understood in that moment of desperate vulnerability, while I clutched my phone with shaking hands and tried to breathe through the panic constricting my chest, was that every tear I shed was signing Marcus's death warrant in blood, that Dante Volkov was not the kind of man who heard a woman cry and simply offered sympathy or advice about domestic violence hotlines and restraining orders that were just paper shields against men who had already proven they didn't care about rules or consequences. The apartment around me looked like a crime scene, and I suppose in some ways it was, with shattered glass glittering on the hardwood floors like deadly diamonds catching the streetlight, filtering through the windows. Marcus had been too rage-blind to close before he started throwing things and screaming about how I'd embarrassed him at dinner with his colleagues by being too quiet, too boring, not engaging enough, failing once again to be the perfect accessory he wanted on his arm to prove to the world that he was successful and desirable and worthy of envy. My cream-colored couch had a wine stain spreading across it like a bloodstain, dark and accusatory, from where he'd hurled his glass at me and missed. And I'd been pathetically grateful that his aim had been off even, while part of me wondered if next time it wouldn't be, if next time the glass would connect with my skull instead of the wall behind me, if this pattern of escalation I'd been tracking with growing dread would eventually end with me in a hospital or worse. The gallery prints I'd carefully hung on the walls, replicas of Klimt and Monet that I'd bought with my first paycheck when I moved to the city 3 years ago, full of hope and ambition and naive dreams about building a life that mattered, were crooked or fallen. Their frames cracked, their glass fronts splintered into spiderweb patterns that reminded me uncomfortably of how fractured I felt inside, how many pieces of myself I'd lost trying to keep Marcus calm and happy and satisfied with a woman who could never quite measure up to his impossible standards. I don't even remember finding Dante's card in the chaos. Don't recall the moment my fingers closed around the thick, expensive cardstock with its embossed lettering that screamed wealth and power and danger. But suddenly there it was in my hand like fate or stupidity or both. And I was dialing before I could think about what it meant to call a man like Dante Volkov at 3 a.m, before I could consider the implications of reaching out to someone who'd given me his private number with eyes so dark they looked black in the gallery's dramatic lighting, and a voice like smoke and velvet when he'd said, "If you ever need anything, Isla, you call me, understand?" I'd nodded then, 3 months ago, thinking it was just the kind of thing powerful men said to feel magnanimous, never imagining I'd actually use it, never believing that a chance encounter at a charity auction, where I'd explained the symbolism in a brutalist painting he'd ended up buying for $200,000, like it was pocket change, would lead to this moment of desperate connection across the city's sleeping darkness. Isla. His voice came through the phone like an anchor, steady and deep and certain, cutting through my hysteria with the kind of calm authority that made something in my chest unclench slightly, even as I hiccuped through sobs that racked my whole body, and made it hard to form coherent words. Tell me where you are, and tell me what happened, and do not leave anything out, because I need to understand exactly what I'm walking into, and what needs to be handled. The way he said handled should have warned me, should have sent up red flags about what kind of man speaks in those terms. But I was drowning, and he was offering me something that felt like salvation, even if I didn't understand the price tag yet. So I told him everything in a rush of words that tumbled over each other desperately. I told him about Marcus's jealousy that had started small, comments about my clothes being too revealing when they weren't, questions about male coworkers that felt like interrogations, subtle isolation from my friends until I barely saw anyone anymore, and had grown into something monstrous and controlling that made me feel like I was suffocating under the weight of his paranoia and rage. I told him about tonight's explosion over nothing, over perceived slights that existed only in Marcus's head, about how he'd grabbed my face hard enough to leave finger-shaped bruises on my jaw and shoved me into the bookshelf so hard that books had rained down on me like literary condemnation for my failures as a girlfriend. I told him about the fear, the constant walking on eggshells, the way I'd started to believe Marcus's poison that I was lucky anyone would put up with me, that I was difficult and ungrateful, and the problem in our relationship, that maybe I deserved the way he treated me because I kept failing to be better, easier, more compliant. Address. Dante's voice had gone cold, flat, deadly in a way that penetrated through my emotional fog and made me shiver for reasons that had nothing to do with the autumn chill coming through my still open window. Give me your address now, Isla, and lock your door, and do not open it for anyone except me. Do you understand? I rattled off my address through chattering teeth, my body starting to shake with delayed shock and adrenaline crash, and I could hear him moving on the other end of the line, the rustle of expensive fabric, and the jingle of keys, and the efficient sounds of a man accustomed to mobilizing quickly when situations demanded action. Where is he now? Dante asked, and there was something in his tone that made my stomach drop, some quality of contained violence that suddenly made me wonder what exactly I'd set in motion by calling him, what kind of response I'd triggered in a man whose reputation I'd heard whispered about in gallery circles when he came to events, rumors about his family's business interests that extended far beyond the legitimate real estate empire they claimed publicly, stories about the Volkov name carrying weight in circles, where power was measured in fear and loyalty rather than stock portfolios. He left, I whispered, hugging myself with my free arm and trying to stop shaking, trying to hold myself together when I felt like I was coming apart at the seams. He stormed out maybe 20 minutes ago, said he was going to cool off, but Dante, he'll come back. He always comes back. And when he does, he'll either be apologetic and want to have make-up sex like nothing happened, or he'll be even angrier because he's had time to work himself up more, and I can't do this anymore. I can't keep living like this, waiting for the next explosion, wondering which version of him is going to walk through that door. He won't be coming back. The certainty in Dante's voice was absolute, unshakable, and I didn't understand what he meant then, didn't grasp the full implications of his promise, but something in those 4 words made me believe him with a faith that defied logic. I'm 10 minutes away, maybe less if traffic cooperates. And Isla, listen to me very carefully. You did the right thing calling me, you understand? You should have called me the first time he put his hands on you, but we'll discuss that later. Right now, I just need you to stay on the phone with me until I get there, and I need you to keep talking so I know you're all right. So I talked, rambling and disjointed, about everything and nothing, about how I'd met Marcus 2 years ago when he'd come into the gallery looking for art for his new condo, and I'd thought he was charming and successful and interested in culture, about how the red flags I'd ignored in the beginning had been small enough that I'd convinced myself I was being paranoid or judgmental or expecting too much. I talked about my job at the Rothschild Gallery, where I'd worked my way up from receptionist to assistant curator, about my love for impressionist paintings, and the way art could capture emotion in brushstrokes and color in ways that words sometimes couldn't, about my small life that had somehow become even smaller under Marcus's controlling influence, until I barely recognized the confident woman I'd been before him. Dante listened, made small encouraging sounds that kept me talking, asked questions that showed he was actually hearing me, and not just placating me until he could arrive and handle whatever situation he'd decided this was. And there was something deeply comforting about his focused attention, even as part of me wondered what I was doing. What kind of mess I was creating by bringing a man like Dante Volkov into my catastrophic personal life. When his knock came, exactly 11 minutes after I'd called him, which meant he'd driven through the city like the laws of traffic and speed limits didn't apply to him, which they probably didn't. I jumped so hard I nearly dropped my phone, my heart hammering against my ribs like it was trying to escape the cage of my body. "It's me," Dante said through both the phone and the door, his voice somehow reassuring despite everything I knew or suspected about him. And I stumbled over the debris field of my destroyed apartment to unlock the door with fingers that shook so badly it took me 3 tries to work the deadbolt. He filled my doorway like a dangerous promise. Well over 6 feet of solid muscle wrapped in black slacks, and a white dress shirt he'd clearly thrown on in a hurry, because it wasn't buttoned quite right, and he wasn't wearing a tie, and his dark hair was slightly mussed like he'd run his hands through it repeatedly during the drive over. But what captured me completely were his eyes, black as midnight, and burning with a cold fury that was somehow more terrifying than if he'd been hot with rage. As they swept over me, cataloging every visible injury, every tear track on my face, every sign of violence and destruction in the apartment behind me. His jaw was tight enough that I could see the muscle jumping beneath the stubble, darkening it, and his hands, elegant and strong and decorated with a single silver ring on his right hand that caught the hallway light, clenched into fists at his sides like he was physically restraining himself from some action I couldn't quite imagine. Isla. My name came out like a prayer, or a curse, or possibly both. And then he was moving into my space, his hands coming up to frame my face with a gentleness that seemed impossible from someone radiating such controlled violence, his thumbs brushing away my tears with a tenderness that made my breath catch and fresh sobs threaten to break free from my chest. He examined my injuries with clinical focus, the rapidly swelling cheek, the split lip I hadn't even noticed until his thumb carefully avoided it, the bruises already forming on my jaw in the distinctive pattern of finger marks, and with each discovery, something in his expression grew darker and more deadly until I was suddenly, viscerally aware that I was looking at a man who was capable of extraordinary violence and who was currently considering exactly how to deploy it. "Do you want him gone, or do you want him erased?" Dante asked, his voice low and rough and absolutely serious. And I stared at him in confusion, because I didn't understand the question, didn't grasp the distinction he was making between those two options, couldn't comprehend what he was actually offering me in that moment. I don't understand," I whispered, my voice hoarse from crying and screaming and fear. And Dante's expression softened fractionally, though the murder in his eyes didn't diminish at all, as he seemed to recognize my innocence about the darker realities of his world and the choices available to people who operated in it. "Gone means he leaves the city, understands that you are under my protection now, and knows that if he ever comes near you again, or speaks your name, or even thinks about you too hard, the consequences will be severe," Dante explained with the patience of someone laying out a business proposal, his hands still cradling my face like I was something precious and breakable. "Erased means he ceases to be a problem in any capacity, permanently and completely, and you never have to worry about him again for the rest of your life because men who hurt women the way he hurt you don't deserve second chances or rehabilitation or the opportunity to do this to someone else down the line." The implications crashed over me like ice water, and I should have been horrified, should have pulled away from him and told him he was insane and called the police and chosen the normal, legal path of restraining orders and documented abuse and hoping the justice system would protect me. But standing there in my destroyed apartment with my face throbbing and my spirit crushed, and my future looking like an endless cycle of Marcus's violence, or the exhausting work of constantly looking over my shoulder if he just left the city, I found I didn't have the energy or the will to choose the moral high ground that would likely just get me killed eventually anyway. So instead of answering with words, instead of making a choice I'd have to carry the weight of consciously, I just nodded through my tears. A tiny movement that Dante caught with those sharp, observant eyes, and I saw satisfaction flash across his face mixed with something that might have been approval, or possession, or the beginning of an obsession I was too naive to recognize yet. "Good girl," he murmured, and then his phone was in his hand, and he was making a call in rapid Russian that I couldn't follow, but that sounded efficient and final, giving orders and locations and instructions that were clearly about handling Marcus in whatever way Dante had decided was appropriate based on my inadequate response. When he finished, he pocketed the phone and turned his full attention back to me, and I realized with a mixture of terror and strange relief that I had just crossed a line that couldn't be, uncrossed, had stepped from my ordinary life into something darker and more dangerous, had essentially given Dante Volkov permission to commit murder on my behalf, even if I hadn't said the words explicitly, and somehow, standing there looking up at a man who was promising me safety through violence. I couldn't bring myself to regret it yet because all I could feel was overwhelming exhaustion and the desperate hope that maybe, finally, someone would make Marcus stop hurting me since I'd proven too weak or damaged or trapped to make him stop myself. "You're coming with me," Dante said. Not a question, but a statement of fact. And before I could protest or ask where or explain that I couldn't just leave my apartment like this, he'd scooped me up into his arms like I weighed nothing at all, cradling me against his chest that smelled like expensive cologne and something darker underneath. Something that whispered of gunpowder and danger and choices that couldn't be undone, and I let him carry me out of my destroyed apartment and down to the street where a black SUV waited with tinted windows, and a driver who didn't even blink at the sight of his boss, carrying a crying, injured woman. And as Dante settled me into the leather-back seat and buckled me in with careful attention to my injuries, I caught sight of two other men in a second vehicle behind us, men with hard faces and harder eyes who looked at Dante with the kind of loyalty that was earned through blood and fear. And I understood with crystal clarity that I had just traded one kind of danger for another, except this danger was sitting beside me in the back seat, one possessive hand on my thigh, while he made more phone calls arranging things I couldn't follow. And the truly terrifying part was that I felt safer in this moment, surrounded by obvious criminals and driving toward an unknown destination, than I had felt in my own apartment with a man I dated for 2 years, which suggested that my judgment was fundamentally broken, or that I'd been living in hell for so long that anything else looked like salvation, even if salvation came wrapped in Italian leather and Russian efficiency and the cold promise of violence done in my name. I woke up in silk sheets that cost more than my monthly rent, surrounded by softness and luxury that felt obscene against my bruised skin, and for several disorienting moments I couldn't remember where I was or how I'd gotten here. My mind still fuzzy with whatever sedative Dante had given me in the car when my panic attack had escalated to the point where I couldn't breathe, and he'd murmured something soothing in Russian while pressing a small pill into my palm and insisting I take it, promising me it would help me rest and that I'd be safe while I slept. The room around me was enormous, decorated in shades of cream and gold with floor-to-ceiling windows that showcased a view of the city I'd never seen from this height or angle. And I realized with a jolt of adrenaline that cut through my grogginess that I was in a penthouse, probably Dante's penthouse based on the masculine elegance of the furnishings and the subtle scent of his cologne lingering in the air. And I had absolutely no memory of arriving here, or being put to bed, or anything beyond that moment in the SUV when the pill had dragged me down into darkness that was mercifully free of nightmares about Marcus, or consequences, or the choices I'd made in my destroyed apartment. My phone sat on the nightstand beside me, plugged into a charger I hadn't put there, and when I checked the time I nearly gasped because it was past noon, which meant I'd missed my morning shift at the gallery, and Claire was probably furious with me for not calling in. And the panic of that realization, of failing at my job, of disappointing my boss, of being unreliable in the one area of my life where I'd managed to maintain some competence despite Marcus's best efforts to undermine my confidence, sent me scrambling out of the bed before I remembered that I was wearing silk pajamas I'd never seen before, expensive and perfectly fitted, which meant someone had undressed me and changed me while I was unconscious, and that thought brought a flush of embarrassment and violation that warred with the practical understanding that whoever had done it had probably been trying to make me comfortable. The door opened before I could decide what to do about my situation, and a woman walked in, carrying a tray laden with food that smelled incredible and made my stomach growl with a hunger I hadn't noticed until that moment. And she was striking in a way that made me feel inadequate and disheveled by comparison. Tall and lean with sharp cheekbones and ice blue eyes, and platinum blonde hair pulled back in a severe ponytail that somehow made her look more elegant rather than harsh, dressed in tailored black pants and a silk blouse that screamed wealth and taste. "You're awake," she observed in accented English that marked her as Russian like Dante, her tone neither warm nor cold, but something in between, assessing. And she set the tray down on the table by the windows with efficient grace before turning to study me with an intensity that made me want to fidget or apologize or explain myself, even though I had no idea what I'd be apologizing for. "I'm Katya, Dante's sister, and before you panic about the clothing situation, I changed you last night because you were covered in glass dust and dried blood, and my brother thought you'd rest better in something clean and comfortable, so you can direct any outrage about that invasion of privacy to him. Though I suspect you'll find he's unapologetic about doing whatever he deems necessary for your well-being." Her directness was startling and somehow refreshing after years of Marcus's manipulative communication style that turned every conversation into a minefield where I never knew which words would trigger an explosion. And I found myself nodding dumbly while she gestured for me to sit at the table and began uncovering dishes that revealed a breakfast spread that looked like something from a 5-star hotel. Perfectly poached eggs, smoked salmon, fresh pastries, fruit arranged like art, coffee that smelled like heaven. "Eat," Katya commanded, and there was something in her voice that suggested she was accustomed to being obeyed, that she carried her own kind of authority separate from but related to her brother's more obvious power. And I sat because my legs were shaky and my head was spinning, and because refusing seemed more complicated than complying. She settled into the chair across from me with her own cup of coffee, watching me with those unsettling blue eyes, while I forced myself to take a bite of pastry that turned out to be exactly as delicious as it looked, buttery and flaky, and probably made by some chef who charged obscene amounts for their expertise and the normalcy of eating while this beautiful, dangerous woman studied me felt surreal, given everything that had happened in the last 12 hours. "Marcus is being handled," Katya said with the same casual tone someone might use to discuss weather or traffic, and the pastry turned to ash in my mouth as the reality of what that meant crashed over me again. The understanding that somewhere in the city right now, terrible things were happening to a man I'd dated for 2 years. A man who'd told me he loved me even while he hurt me, and those terrible things were happening because I'd cried to Dante Volkov and nodded when he'd asked me a question I hadn't fully understood. "Don't look like that," Katya continued, her expression softening slightly in what might have been sympathy or pity or just impatience with my obvious distress. "Men like your ex-boyfriend are predators who rely on their victims feeling guilty or responsible for the violence inflicted on them. And that guilt is what keeps women trapped in cycles of abuse that often end in murder or permanent injury. So whatever you're feeling right now about his fate, remember that he made choices that led him here, that he chose to put his hands on you in anger, that he chose to make you afraid in your own home. And the consequences of those choices are his to bear, not yours." I wanted to argue, wanted to insist that I wasn't that kind of person who sanctioned violence or revenge, that there had to be another way to handle this situation that didn't involve whatever was happening to Marcus right now. But the words died in my throat because Katya was right in a way that made me deeply uncomfortable. I had been trapped, had been too afraid or conditioned or broken to leave on my own, And maybe I did bear some responsibility for calling someone I knew was dangerous, instead of calling the police or a domestic violence shelter, or any of the legitimate resources that existed for women in my situation. "He won't be coming back," Katya said, echoing Dante's words, from last night with the same absolute certainty, and then she was pulling out her phone and showing me something that made my blood run cold. A news alert about a car found abandoned at the docks. Marcus's car, according to the license plate visible in the photo, with evidence of blood and signs of struggle but no body. And the reporter was speculating about foul play and possible connections to organized crime. "This is what protection looks like in our world," Katya explained, her voice matter-of-fact and educational, like she was teaching me important survival skills for a reality I'd stumbled into without preparation. "My brother doesn't do anything halfway, has never in his life approached a problem with half measures or hesitation. So when you cried to him about a man who hurt you, you became his to protect. And that means you don't leave this penthouse without security. You don't run back to your old life pretending this didn't happen. And you definitely don't ask questions about where Marcus went or what happened to him. Because knowing those details won't help you sleep better at night, and will only burden you with knowledge that could be dangerous if the wrong people decide to ask you about it." The implications of her words settled over me like a weighted blanket, suffocating and inescapable. And I realized with growing horror and strange fascination that I had somehow become entangled with the Volkov family in a way that wasn't going to be easily undone, that calling Dante had been like pulling a thread that unraveled my entire existence and rewove it into a pattern I didn't recognize. "I need to call my work," I said weakly, grasping at the normal responsibilities of my ordinary life, like they were lifelines that could pull me back from this precipice. And Katya smiled, a sharp, knowing expression that suggested she'd seen this particular reaction before and found it both predictable and ultimately futile. "Already handled," she informed me, and I blinked at her in confusion while she explained with efficient brevity that Dante had called the gallery this morning, had spoken directly to the owner Richard Rothschild, who apparently owed the Volkov family significant favors from some past business arrangement I didn't want to examine too closely, and had explained that I was dealing with a personal emergency and would need time off. And Richard had apparently been so eager to accommodate Dante's request that he'd offered me paid leave and told me to take all the time I needed to handle my situation. "You see how this works?" Katya asked, leaning forward slightly with an intensity that pinned me in place. "This is what it means to be under Volkov protection. Your problems become our problems. Your needs become our responsibility. Your safety becomes our priority. And in exchange, you give us your loyalty and your trust and your acceptance that we operate by different rules than the ordinary world you came from." I should have been outraged by the presumption, by the way Dante had reached into my life and made decisions without consulting me, by the casual manipulation of my employer, and the dismantling of my autonomy. But sitting there in silk pajamas in a penthouse I couldn't afford in 1,000 lifetimes, while eating breakfast that probably cost more than my weekly grocery budget, I couldn't muster the energy for righteous indignation, because the truth was that I felt safer than I had in months, maybe years. And that safety had a price I was apparently willing to pay even if I didn't fully understand what I was purchasing with my compliance. "What does Dante want from me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, because men like him didn't extend this kind of protection or expend this level of resources without expecting something in return. And I needed to understand what I'd implicitly agreed to when I'd nodded through my tears and let him carry me away from my destroyed apartment. Katya studied me for a long moment, her expression unreadable, and then she laughed, a sound that was surprisingly warm and genuine despite the circumstances. "That's the question, isn't it?" she mused, standing and moving to look out the windows at the city sprawling below us like a kingdom her family controlled through invisible threads of power and influence. "My brother is many things: ruthless, calculating, absolutely terrifying when someone threatens what he considers his. But he's not complicated in his motivations, at least not where you're concerned, because I've known Dante my entire life, and I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looked at you last night. Like you were something precious he'd finally found after searching without knowing he was searching. And that kind of obsessive focus from a man like him is either the greatest blessing or the most dangerous curse, depending on how you handle it. The words hung in the air between us, heavy with implications I wasn't ready to unpack, and before I could formulate a response or ask for clarification about what exactly Katya meant by obsessive focus, the door opened again, and Dante himself walked in, and the energy in the room shifted immediately, became charged and dangerous, and somehow electric in a way that made my skin prickle with awareness. He looked different in daylight, still devastatingly handsome in that dark, dangerous way that probably should have repelled me but instead drew me in with magnetic inevitability, dressed now in perfectly tailored charcoal slacks and a black sweater that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders and the lean strength of his frame. And when his eyes found me across the room, they softened fractionally in a way that suggested Katya might have been right about that obsessive focus she'd mentioned. "You're awake," he said, his voice that same smoke and velvet texture I remembered from the phone, and he moved toward me with predatory grace that reminded me he was a dangerous man, regardless of how gentle he'd been with me last night. "How are you feeling, Isla? Any pain from your injuries? Any discomfort I should know about so I can have a doctor come examine you properly?" The casual mention of having a doctor on call like it was the most normal thing in the world reinforced everything Katya had told me about the Volkov family's resources and reach, and I shook my head mutely because my injuries were minor, compared to the psychological whiplash of processing everything that had happened and was continuing to happen. Dante pulled out the chair beside me and sat close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his body and smell his cologne mixing with something uniquely him, and his hand came up to tilt my face toward the light so he could examine my bruises with clinical focus that somehow felt intimate and possessive. "These will heal," he murmured, his thumb tracing the edge of the discoloration on my jaw with feather-light touch that made me shiver, for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. But the fear, the conditioning, the way he made you doubt yourself and accept treatment you never should have tolerated, those wounds are deeper and will take longer to address, so you'll be staying here where I can ensure you're safe while you recover from more than just physical injuries. It wasn't a question or a request, but a statement of fact, and I opened my mouth to protest, to insist that I had a life and responsibilities, and an apartment that needed to be cleaned up, and belongings that needed to be sorted through. But Dante silenced me with a look that was both gentle and absolutely implacable. "Your apartment is being handled by a cleaning crew I hired. Your belongings are being packed and will be brought here by the end of the day, and your lease is being terminated early, with full financial compensation to your landlord, because that space holds nothing but bad memories now and you won't be returning to it," he explained with the same efficient authority Katya had displayed. And I realized that while I'd been sleeping, the Volkov siblings had systematically dismantled my old life and begun constructing something new without bothering to ask my permission or preference. "As for your responsibilities, you have none beyond healing and allowing yourself to be protected, because everything else can wait or be managed by people I employ for exactly these purposes. And I won't have you rushing back to normalcy and pretending last night didn't fundamentally change things, because it did change things, Isla. It changed everything, and the sooner you accept that, the easier this transition will be for you." The presumption of it should have made me angry, should have triggered my independence and self-respect, and whatever remained of my ability to advocate for myself after 2 years of Marcus grinding those qualities down to nothing. But instead what I felt was a confusing mixture of relief and resentment and something darker that might have been desire, because there was something intoxicating about being claimed so thoroughly by a man who clearly had the power and resources to back up his declarations. "What am I supposed to do here?" I asked, gesturing at the opulent penthouse around us, and Dante smiled, a slow, predatory expression that made my pulse quicken and my breath catch in a way that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with the attraction I'd been trying to ignore since he'd appeared in my doorway last night, radiating controlled violence and protective fury. "Whatever you want," he said simply. "Read, paint if that's something you enjoy. Explore the penthouse and the building amenities. Spend time with Katya, who could use female companionship since she's surrounded by men in our organization. Order anything you desire and it will be provided. But mostly just rest and let yourself process what you've been through without Marcus's influence poisoning your thoughts and making you doubt your worth." Katya excused herself with a knowing look that suggested she was deliberately leaving us alone, and suddenly the enormous room felt much smaller with just Dante and me, the air between us thick with tension. I didn't know how to navigate because I'd never been good at reading men's intentions, and Marcus had spent 2 years convincing me that I was undesirable and difficult, and lucky anyone wanted me at all. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, needing to understand his motivations because nothing in my life had prepared me for a man extending this level of care and protection without explicit strings attached or expectations clearly stated. Dante leaned back in his chair, studying me with those fathomless dark eyes that seemed to see straight through whatever shields I tried to maintain. And when he spoke, his voice was low and rough with an honesty that felt more dangerous than any lie could have been. Because 3 months ago I walked into a gallery, looking to make a legitimate purchase that would help launder some money through legal art market transactions. And I saw you explaining a painting to an elderly couple with such passion and knowledge and genuine love for the art that I forgot why I was there, forgot the business transaction I was supposed to be completing. And all I could think about was how someone that vibrant and intelligent and beautiful was also somehow sad in a way I recognized. Sad in a way that suggested damage I knew how to identify because I've seen it often enough in this life I lead. His confession hung between us, raw and unexpected, and I didn't know what to do with the vulnerability he was showing me, or the implications of what he was saying about having noticed me, truly seen me, in a way that felt impossible given the brief nature of our interaction that night at the gallery. "I gave you my card because I wanted an excuse to see you again, wanted to offer you a way out if you needed one, and then I waited like a fool for 3 months hoping you'd call for any reason at all, and when you finally did, when I heard you crying and afraid and hurt, I wanted to burn the entire city down to get to you, wanted to destroy anyone who'd ever made you feel unsafe, and yes, maybe that's obsessive and unhealthy and exactly the kind of possessive behavior you should run from. But I'm not going to pretend to be something I'm not, or apologize for protecting you in the only way I know how, which is absolutely and completely and with extreme prejudice toward anyone who threatens your well-being." The intensity in his voice matched the intensity in his eyes, and I understood with sudden clarity that Katya had been absolutely right about her brother's obsessive focus, that I had somehow become the object of Dante Volkov's attention in a way that would reshape my existence whether I wanted it to or not. And the truly terrifying part was that sitting there in his penthouse wearing his sister's carefully chosen silk pajamas while he looked at me like I was something worth burning cities for, I found I didn't want to run from it at all, which suggested that maybe Marcus had damaged something fundamental in my ability to recognize danger. Or maybe, possibly, the danger Dante represented was so different from Marcus's casual cruelty that my broken instincts couldn't categorize it properly, and were instead responding to the promise of protection and desire and being valued in ways I'd never experienced before. Even if that promise came wrapped in violence and organized crime, and the casual dismantling of a man's existence because he'd made me cry. The days blurred together in Dante's penthouse like watercolors bleeding into each other on expensive canvas, and I found myself suspended in a strange liminal space between my old life and whatever new existence was being constructed around me with meticulous care by people who seemed to understand that I was fragile in ways that went beyond the fading bruises on my face, that Marcus had broken something inside me that would take more than luxury accommodations and protection details to repair. Dante was around more than I'd expected for a man who supposedly ran a criminal empire that required constant attention and management, appearing at odd hours to check on me with an intensity that should have felt suffocating, but instead made me feel seen in ways I'd never experienced, asking questions about my preferences and opinions on everything from what kind of coffee I liked, to what period of art history resonated most deeply with me, to whether I preferred reading physical books or digital ones, and then somehow ensuring that whatever I mentioned appeared as if by magic. My favorite Ethiopian blend brewing in the kitchen each morning. Art books about the Impressionists I'd mentioned loving, scattered throughout the penthouse for me to discover. A small library of first edition novels materializing in what had apparently been designated as my personal space within his home. We talked during those encounters, conversations that started superficial and gradually deepened as I became more comfortable with his presence, and less afraid that he would transform into someone violent and unpredictable like Marcus had always done. And I learned things about Dante that complicated my understanding of him as simply a dangerous criminal. That he'd been raised in Moscow until his father moved the family to America when he was 12. That he'd studied economics at Columbia before being pulled into the family business when his father was murdered by a rival organization. That he collected art not just for money laundering purposes, but because he genuinely appreciated the way artists captured emotion and truth in ways that words often couldn't. And that he had a younger brother named Alexei who ran their operations in Brighton Beach, and who apparently thought Dante's interest in me was hilarious evidence that even the most ruthless men eventually fell victim to irrational attachment. The chemistry between us was undeniable and growing stronger with each interaction, crackling in the air whenever we occupied the same space, and I caught him watching me with an intensity that made my skin flush and my breath quicken in ways that felt like betrayal to my traumatized psyche, that insisted I should be afraid of powerful men and their focused attention. He touched me often, but always carefully, as if testing boundaries and my comfort level, a hand at the small of my back when we walked through the penthouse, fingers brushing mine when he handed me coffee, palms cupping my face when he examined my healing injuries with possessive concern, and each touch sent electricity through my nervous system that confused and frightened and excited me in equal measure because I hadn't felt desire in so long, had thought Marcus had killed that part of me along with my confidence and self-worth, and discovering it was merely dormant rather than destroyed felt like a resurrection I wasn't prepared for. Katya visited frequently, often bringing other women from what she vaguely referred to as the family, who treated me with surprising warmth and acceptance despite my outsider status, and through their conversations and casual mentions of business matters they thought I wouldn't understand, I began to piece together a more complete picture of the Volkov organization, that they controlled significant portions of the city's port operations and construction contracts, that they had connections in local government and law enforcement that made them essentially untouchable, that other families respected and feared them in equal measure, and that Dante's reputation for ruthless efficiency and absolute loyalty to his people made him one of the most powerful and dangerous men in the entire northeastern criminal underworld. The knowledge should have terrified me, should have sent me running to the authorities, or at least attempting to extricate myself from this increasingly complicated situation. But instead, I found myself settling into the strange new rhythm of my life, with an ease that suggested either psychological damage or adaptation, or possibly both. And when the nightmares came, vivid dreams of Marcus finding me, hurting me worse than before, punishing me for leaving and involving people who scared him, Dante was somehow always there, appearing in my room within seconds of my waking gasps, as if he'd been listening for signs of my distress, pulling me against his chest and murmuring soothing words in Russian while his hands stroked my hair and back with infinite patience, until my breathing calmed and my heart stopped trying to escape my ribcage. "You're safe," he would tell me in that voice like smoke and dark promises, and I would believe him because believing felt easier than accepting that I might never feel safe again, that Marcus had permanently altered my ability to exist in the world without constant hypervigilance and fear. And in those vulnerable midnight moments when Dante held me and whispered assurances and made me feel protected rather than trapped, I felt something shifting inside me, some fundamental recalibration of my understanding about what strength looked like, and whether safety always had to come wrapped in conventional morality and socially acceptable choices. It was during one of our late-night conversations, 2 weeks after he'd carried me out of my destroyed apartment. 2 weeks of careful distance and building trust, and him demonstrating through actions rather than words that he meant what he said about protection and care. That everything changed between us in ways that couldn't be undone or walked back or pretended hadn't happened. We'd been talking about art, specifically about a Caravaggio painting I'd mentioned loving for its dramatic use of light and shadow, and Dante had been listening with that focused attention he gave me that made me feel like the most fascinating person he'd ever encountered. And somehow the conversation had shifted to beauty and darkness, and whether one could exist meaningfully without the other. And he'd said something about how the most beautiful things in his life had always been touched by darkness or danger, or the potential for destruction. And I'd understood without him saying it explicitly that he was talking about me, about us, about whatever was developing between a traumatized art gallery assistant and a Bratva boss who'd decided she was his to protect and keep, and possibly claim in ways that went far beyond simple guardianship. "You look at me like you're not afraid," Dante observed, his voice low and rough in the dim lighting of his living room, where we'd been sitting on opposite ends of his obscenely expensive leather couch, maintaining careful physical distance even as the emotional distance between us had been steadily evaporating. "Everyone else, who knows what I am, what I'm capable of, they look at me with fear or calculation or respect born from self-preservation. But you, Isla, you look at me like you see something worth trusting despite everything you know about how I handle problems and the violence I'm willing to deploy to protect what's mine." His observation stripped away pretense and forced me to confront what I'd been avoiding acknowledging even to myself. That I wasn't afraid of him. Not really. Not in the way I should be given what I'd witnessed of his capacity for cold ruthlessness, and what I'd inferred about his methods from overheard conversations and news reports about investigations into organized crime that seemed to mysteriously stall whenever they got close to the Volkov family interests. "I should be afraid," I admitted, drawing my knees up to my chest in a defensive posture that probably revealed more about my psychological state than I intended. "Everything about this situation should terrify me. The violence you're capable of, the casual way you dismantled Marcus's existence, the fact that I'm essentially living with a man I barely know who runs a criminal organization and who's made decisions about my life without consulting me. But the truth is that the only time I've felt genuinely safe in years has been here, with you, surrounded by your people and your protection. And I don't know what that says about me or my judgment, or whether Marcus damaged me so thoroughly that I can't recognize danger anymore when it's dressed in expensive clothes and offering me kindness wrapped in control." Dante moved then, closing the distance between us on the couch, with predatory grace that made my breath catch, and suddenly he was right there in my space, close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, and smell his cologne mixing with something uniquely him that I'd become embarrassingly addicted to over the past 2 weeks. "You recognize danger just fine," he said, his voice dropping into a register that made heat pool low in my stomach, and my pulse quicken with something that definitely wasn't fear. "You're just finally understanding the difference between danger that wants to hurt you and danger that wants to protect you, between men who use their power to control and diminish you, and men who use their power to ensure no one ever makes you feel small, or afraid, or worthless again. And if that realization makes you question your judgment or sanity, then maybe your judgment was the problem all along, because it led you to Marcus, instead of someone who would have cherished you the way you deserved." His hand came up to cup my face, thumb tracing the faded bruise on my jaw that was now just a yellowish shadow of the violence it represented. And the gentleness of his touch contrasted so sharply with the intensity burning in his eyes that I felt something crack inside me. Some final wall I'd been maintaining between us, crumbling under the weight of his focused attention and obvious desire. "I want you," Dante said with the same straightforward honesty he'd shown me since that first night. No games or manipulation, or pretending his intentions were anything other than what they were. "I've wanted you since I saw you at that gallery 3 months ago. Wanted you in ways that go beyond physical attraction, though I'd be lying if I said I didn't think about what you'd look like in my bed, under me, saying my name like a prayer while I make you forget every man who came before me. But what I want more than that is your trust, your loyalty, your acceptance that you belong here with me, that you're mine to protect and keep and care for in ways that probably seem excessive and possessive, but that's who I am, Isla. I don't do anything halfway, and I won't apologize for wanting to wrap you up in safety so complete that you never have to be afraid again. The confession hung between us, raw and honest and completely overwhelming, and I should have been, scared by the possessiveness in his words and the implication that he saw me as his, in some fundamental way, that suggested ownership. But instead what I felt was desire so intense it almost hurt. Need that had been building for 2 weeks of careful touches and heated looks and conversations that felt more intimate than anything I'd experienced with Marcus in 2 years of dating. "Kiss me," I whispered, the words escaping before I could think better of them, before I could analyze whether this was healthy or smart, or a terrible idea born from trauma bonding and Stockholm Syndrome and my obviously broken ability to make good decisions about men. Dante's eyes darkened with something primitive and possessive, and then his mouth was on mine and the world narrowed to just this, his lips moving against mine with controlled intensity, his hand sliding into my hair to angle my head exactly how he wanted it, his other arm wrapping around my waist to pull me closer until I was practically in his lap. And I kissed him back with desperate hunger that surprised us both, my hands fisting in his shirt and pulling him closer even though there was no closer to get. He kissed like he did everything else, with absolute focus and devastating competence, learning what made me gasp and moan and press harder against him. And when his teeth caught my bottom lip and tugged gently, I made a sound I'd never made before, needy and wanton and completely uninhibited. And I felt him smile against my mouth, before he deepened the kiss into something that felt like claiming, like a promise, like the beginning of something that would consume us both if we let it. When we finally broke apart, both breathing hard and staring at each other with a mixture of desire and recognition that something fundamental had shifted between us. Dante pressed his forehead to mine and exhaled slowly, as if trying to regain control that had slipped during our kiss. "Tell me to stop and I will," he said, his voice rough with want and restraint, and I realized he was giving me an out, offering me the choice to pull back from this precipice we were balanced on. But the problem was that I didn't want to stop, didn't want to return to the careful distance we'd been maintaining, didn't want to pretend I wasn't attracted to him, or that I didn't feel safer and more valued with him than I'd ever felt with anyone else. Despite the moral complications and the violence he represented, and the fact that I was absolutely making decisions based on trauma and vulnerability that I'd probably regret when I was thinking more clearly. "Don't stop," I told him, my hands still fisted in his shirt, my body pressed against his in ways that left no question about what I wanted. "Don't stop, and don't apologize for being possessive or protective or whatever this is between us, because I'm tired of overthinking and analyzing and trying to figure out if I'm making terrible choices. And all I know right now is that when you touch me, I feel alive instead of afraid, desired instead of tolerated, and maybe that makes me damaged or stupid or exactly the kind of woman who jumps from one dangerous situation into another, but I don't care anymore because this, you, us, it feels more real than anything I've experienced in years." Dante made a sound low in his chest that was almost a growl, and then he was kissing me again, deeper and harder and with less restraint, his hands moving over my body with possessive appreciation that made me feel beautiful and wanted in ways I'd forgotten were possible. And when he lifted me easily and carried me toward what I assumed was his bedroom, I didn't protest or hesitate or second guess. I just wrapped my arms around his neck and surrendered to whatever this was becoming between us. This dark and dangerous and intensely intimate connection that had been building since the night I called him crying, and he'd responded by dismantling my entire existence and rebuilding it around his protection. He laid me on his bed, dark sheets and masculine decor and the scent of him everywhere, and hovered over me with those intense eyes searching my face for any sign of hesitation or fear. And when he found none, When he saw only desire and trust and acceptance reflecting back at him, something in his expression shifted into pure predatory satisfaction. And I understood that I'd just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, had essentially agreed to become his in whatever way he'd been wanting me to be his. And the weight of that decision should have felt suffocating, but instead felt like freedom. Like finally choosing something for myself, instead of having choices made for me, or being manipulated into decisions that served someone else's interests. Mine, Dante said against my mouth, and it wasn't a question but a statement of fact. A claim he was making on my body and loyalty and future. And I nodded because there didn't seem to be any point in pretending. Otherwise, when we both knew I'd been his from the moment he'd appeared in my doorway, radiating protective violence and promised me safety, I desperately needed. What happened next was intense and overwhelming, and nothing like what I'd experienced with Marcus. Dante was attentive and demanding in equal measure, taking his time learning my body and what made me respond, pushing me toward pleasure with the same focused competence he applied to everything else in his life. And when I finally shattered under his ministrations, I said his name like he'd predicted I would, like a prayer, or a curse, or possibly both. And I felt him smile against my skin in satisfaction that suggested he'd been waiting for exactly this moment since the night we met. Afterward, lying tangled together in his sheets, with his arm locked around my waist like he was afraid I might disappear if he loosened his grip, I felt the reality of what I'd done settling over me. I'd just slept with the man who'd orchestrated my ex-boyfriend's disappearance, had essentially committed myself to someone whose world operated by rules completely foreign to everything I'd been raised to believe about morality and legality and appropriate ways to handle conflict. And I should have felt guilt or shame or regret. But instead I felt satisfied and safe and claimed in ways that suggested my moral compass had been irreparably damaged by Marcus's abuse, or I was finally accepting that safety and protection sometimes came with prices that conventional society would condemn, but that felt worth paying when the alternative was living in constant fear. "What happens now?" I asked quietly, my fingers tracing idle patterns on his chest, while he played with my hair in a gesture that felt both intimate and possessive. And Dante was silent for a long moment before responding in that voice that always made me shiver with its combination of smoke and dark promise. "Now you stay. You let me keep you safe. You accept that you're part of my world and under my protection permanently. And eventually, when you're ready, you stand beside me as my wife because I don't share and I don't do temporary. And I meant what I said about wanting you in ways that go beyond physical attraction. I want you in my life, in my home, wearing my ring and bearing my name so everyone knows you're mine, and that touching you means declaring war on the Volkov family." The casual way he mentioned marriage like it was inevitable, rather than a possibility, should have sent me running, should have triggered every self-preservation instinct I possessed. But instead I felt something warm and terrifying unfurl in my chest that might have been hope or desire or the beginning of something deeper than I was ready to examine. And when I opened my mouth to protest or ask if he was serious, or point out that we barely knew each other despite the intensity of our connection, he silenced me with a kiss that tasted like possession and promise and the kind of forever that people like us, damaged and dangerous, and desperate for something real, probably didn't deserve but reached for anyway, because the alternative was accepting loneliness and fear as permanent conditions of existence. The next morning, I woke up alone in Dante's bed, surrounded by evidence of what had happened between us the night before, and panic started to creep in as I replayed every decision I'd made and wondered if I'd just traded one form of control for another. If Dante's protection would eventually morph into the same kind of suffocating possession that Marcus had wielded like a weapon. But then the bedroom door opened, and Dante appeared carrying a breakfast tray, and wearing an expression of such fierce satisfaction and protective tenderness that my fears dissolved because whatever this was between us, it felt fundamentally different from anything I'd experienced before. It felt like choice rather than coercion, desire rather than obligation. And when he set down the tray and pulled me into his arms and kissed me with a thoroughness that suggested he had no intention of letting me overthink or panic or retreat from what we'd started, I surrendered to it completely. this dark and dangerous love that had been forged in violence and tears, and the kind of obsessive protection that normal people would call unhealthy. But that felt like salvation to someone who'd been drowning for so long. She'd forgotten what breathing freely felt like. And as I sat there in his arms eating breakfast and planning the day ahead like we were any normal couple instead of a crime boss, and the woman whose tears had cost someone their life, I realized with startling clarity that I didn't want to go back to my old life. Didn't want to return to the version of myself who'd accepted crumbs of affection and lived in constant fear. And that realization should have scared me, but instead felt like finally stepping into a version of myself who was strong enough to choose her own darkness rather than having it chosen for her. Even if that choice came with moral complications I'd spend years untangling, and consequences I couldn't begin to predict. Because loving Dante Volkov meant accepting violence and protection as two sides of the same coin, and I was apparently damaged or evolved, or desperate enough to find that acceptable, if it meant never being afraid again. I tried to return to some semblance of normal life after 3 weeks of living in Dante's penthouse like a princess in a tower who'd forgotten she was supposed to want escape. And the attempt at normalcy manifested in me, insisting I needed to go back to work at the gallery, because sitting around being protected and pampered was making me feel useless and decorative in ways that reminded me uncomfortably of how Marcus had wanted me to be. Beautiful and compliant, and existing solely as an extension of his ego, even though Dante's reasons for wanting me safe were obviously different and came from a place of genuine care rather than narcissistic control. Dante had agreed reluctantly to my return to work, but only with conditions that included 2 security guards shadowing me at all times, a driver who took me directly from the penthouse to the gallery and back without deviation, and check-ins every few hours that felt excessive but that I accepted, because I was learning that compromise in his world meant accepting certain non-negotiable boundaries around my safety. And honestly, the security presence made me feel protected, rather than imprisoned, because the outside world still felt dangerous in ways I was processing with the therapist Dante had hired. A woman named Dr. Sarah Chen, who specialized in trauma, and who'd been surprisingly helpful in untangling my complicated feelings about everything that had happened without judging me for my choices or the relationship I'd developed with the man who'd orchestrated my ex-boyfriend's disappearance. Everything changed on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 days after I'd returned to work, when I was alone in the gallery's back office cataloging new acquisitions, and my security detail was stationed outside, giving me the illusion of privacy. And I'd been going through Dante's desk drawers looking for a specific provenance document when my hand closed around a manila envelope that shouldn't have been there, that felt wrong the moment I touched it, and against every instinct telling me to leave it alone and respect boundaries and not seek information I wasn't ready to handle. I opened it and found photographs that made my stomach drop and my hands shake and bile rise in my throat, because they showed Marcus, or what was left of him, after whatever Dante's people had done. And the images were brutal and explicit, and left no room for the comfortable fiction I'd been maintaining, that maybe Marcus had just been scared away, or relocated somewhere far from the city where he couldn't hurt me anymore. The photos showed a warehouse, or basement setting with concrete floors stained dark with what could only be blood, and Marcus was in them. Recognizable despite the damage, and the sequence of images told a story of systematic violence that had clearly taken hours. And there was something methodical and professional about the brutality that suggested this wasn't rage or passion, but cold, calculated punishment designed to make someone suffer before they were finally allowed to die. And I realized with horrifying clarity that this was what protection looked like in Dante's world. This was the price that had been paid for my tears at 3 a.m, and I had known intellectually what had happened, but seeing the evidence was completely different from knowing it abstractly. I don't know how long I sat there staring at those photographs, trying to reconcile the man who held me gently and made me breakfast, and looked at me like I was precious with the man who'd ordered or possibly personally participated in the torture and murder documented in these images, and I felt like I was going to be sick because Marcus had been terrible and abusive, and I'd wanted him gone from my life, but I'd never wanted this, had never consciously wished for him to suffer like this even in my darkest moments of rage and hurt. and the guilt crashed over me in waves that made it hard to breathe because his blood was on my hands, even if I hadn't wielded whatever weapons had been used to inflict that damage. When Dante walked into the office, because of course he would, because he always seemed to know when I was distressed even when I tried to hide it, and saw me sitting there with those photographs spread across the desk, and tears streaming down my face, his expression shifted from concern to something harder and more guarded, and he moved toward me with careful deliberation, like he was approaching something wild and unpredictable that might bolt or attack depending on how he handled the situation. I wasn't supposed to see these, was I? I asked, my voice shaking and barely above a whisper. And Dante's jaw tightened in a way that confirmed my suspicion that he'd kept this evidence of what he'd done deliberately hidden from me because he'd known it would destroy the comfortable distance I'd been maintaining between the protection he offered and the violence he was willing to deploy to provide it. No, you weren't supposed to see them, Dante admitted, and at least he had the decency not to lie or deflect or try to minimize what the photographs showed, and he pulled up a chair beside me and reached for my hands. But I jerked away, because I couldn't bear to be touched right then by hands that had possibly been responsible for inflicting that damage. Isla, look at me, he commanded, with that voice that usually made me compliant, but that now just made me angry and horrified and confused about who I'd become in the weeks since I'd called him crying. Marcus was a monster who hurt you, repeatedly, who would have eventually killed you if left unchecked, because men like him always escalate until they cross that final line. And yes, what happened to him was brutal and excessive by normal standards. But we don't operate by normal standards in my world, and men who put their hands on women in anger don't deserve mercy or quick deaths. They deserve to understand fear and pain and helplessness the way they made their victims feel. So if you're looking for me to apologize or express regret for what was done to him, you won't get it because I'd do it again. I'd do worse, and I'd do it personally rather than delegating if it meant keeping you safe. His words were harsh and uncompromising, and completely in character for who he was, and part of me had known this was his philosophy from the beginning, but hearing him articulate it so clearly, while staring at photographic evidence of its application, was overwhelming in ways I hadn't anticipated, and I felt myself fragmenting into competing reactions, horror at the violence, guilt for my role in initiating it, relief that Marcus truly couldn't hurt me anymore, and something darker that whispered that maybe he'd deserved exactly what he'd gotten, that maybe Dante's brand of absolute justice was more honest than the legal system that so often failed to protect women from abusive partners. You think I'm a monster, Dante said, and it wasn't really a question, but an observation based on whatever he was reading in my expression, and he stood and moved away from me like he was giving me space to process or preparing for me to run, or accepting that this might be the moment where I finally rejected him and everything he represented. Perhaps I am, he continued, his back to me as he stared out the window at the city below, that he controlled through fear and loyalty and strategic violence. But I'm your monster now, and I'd do it again tomorrow if someone else threatened you because that's who I am, Isla. I'm not a good man by conventional standards. I don't solve problems with lawyers and restraining orders and hoping the system will protect the people I care about. I solve problems permanently and brutally, and in ways that ensure they never resurface. And if that makes me irredeemable in your eyes, then tell me now so we can figure out what happens next. The silence stretched between us, heavy with implications and choices, and the fundamental question of whether I could accept loving someone capable of that level of calculated violence. And I stared at those photographs, trying to feel something appropriate. Revulsion, moral clarity, determination to leave and report him to authorities, and do the right thing according to every value I'd been raised with. But what I actually felt was complicated and messy, and suggested that Marcus had broken something in me more fundamental than my ability to trust, had damaged my moral compass so thoroughly that I could look at evidence of torture and murder, and feel primarily relief mixed with guilt rather than pure horror. He came to my apartment 6 times after you threw him out, I heard myself saying, the words emerging from some locked compartment of memory I'd been avoiding examining. 6 times in 3 months before I called you. And each time he apologized and brought flowers and promised he'd changed. And each time I believed him because I wanted to believe that the man I'd fallen in love with was still in there somewhere underneath the rage. And each time it got worse, the violence escalated, the control tightened, the isolation became more complete. And I absolutely knew that one day he was going to kill me, that it was just a matter of time before his hands closed around my throat and didn't let go, or his fist connected with my temple at just the right angle, or he pushed me down the stairs in one of his rages. And I did nothing because I was too afraid, or too conditioned, or too broken to save myself. I finally looked up at Dante, really looked at him, and saw him watching me with an intensity that suggested he was cataloging every micro-expression and trying to predict which way I would break. And I stood on shaking legs and moved toward him, because despite everything, despite the photographs and the violence they represented and the moral compromise accepting him required, he felt like safety in a world that had proven repeatedly it wouldn't protect me through conventional means. "I don't think you're a monster," I said, my voice steadier now even though my hands were still trembling. "Or maybe I do, but I don't care because monsters who hurt women don't deserve mercy. And you're right that he would have killed me eventually. And maybe that makes me just as damaged and morally compromised as you are. But I can't find it in myself to mourn him, or wish you'd handled it differently because I'm alive and whole and not afraid anymore, and that's worth whatever price was paid in blood and violence in some warehouse I'll never see." Dante's expression shifted from guarded to something fiercer and more possessive, and he pulled me against him with bruising intensity and kissed me like he was claiming me all over again. Like my acceptance of his darkness was the most precious gift I could have offered, and I kissed him back with desperate certainty because I'd just made a choice that couldn't be unmade. Had essentially accepted that I was complicit in Marcus's death, and that I could live with that complicity if it meant never being a victim again. And as we stood there in his office with photographs of torture spread across his desk, and my security detail waiting outside, and the whole complicated mess of our relationship laid bare between us, I understood that I'd crossed some fundamental line from innocent victim to willing participant in Dante's dark world, and that crossing felt less like falling, and more like finally claiming agency over my own protection. Even if that agency came wrapped in violence I'd never personally commit, but was willing to sanction when deployed on my behalf. The sound of shattering glass and shouting from the gallery's main floor interrupted our moment, and Dante's entire demeanor shifted instantly from lover to something deadly and focused, his hand moving to the small of his back, where I now knew he kept a gun at all times, and my security detail burst through the office door with weapons drawn and expressions that told me something very wrong was happening. And one of them, Victor, the older Russian who'd been particularly kind to me over the past weeks, said something rapid in Russian that made Dante's face go blank with rage. And then he was pushing me behind him and issuing orders in that same language while pulling his phone and making calls that sounded like he was mobilizing his entire organization. And I caught enough English mixed in to understand that someone had gotten past security, that there was a threat in the building, that this was about me, and the fear that crashed over me was different from what I'd felt with Marcus because this wasn't about one unstable man's rage, but about consequences catching up to choices we'd made, about Dante's enemies seeing me as a vulnerability they could exploit. And I realized with sudden terrible clarity that becoming Volkov's woman hadn't just given me his protection, it had also painted a target on my back that would be visible to everyone who wanted to hurt him. And maybe the real price of safety wasn't just accepting his violence, but accepting that I'd become a weapon that could be used against him if his enemies were clever and ruthless enough to try. The man who'd breached the gallery's security turned out to be Marcus's brother Ryan, a detective with the Metropolitan Police who'd apparently been conducting his own investigation into his brother's disappearance for weeks, piecing together evidence and witness statements and surveillance footage until he'd connected me to Dante and decided that I was somehow responsible for orchestrating Marcus's death, that I'd seduced a dangerous man into eliminating an inconvenient boyfriend. And the rage in his eyes when Dante's security team tackled him to the gallery floor was so similar to Marcus's rage that I felt my body lock up with remembered fear, even though I was surrounded by armed men whose entire purpose was keeping me safe. The standoff that followed was tense and complicated by Ryan's badge and the legal protections it theoretically offered him. But Dante handled it with cold efficiency that reminded me exactly who I'd tied myself to. He made phone calls that brought lawyers and other police officers who were clearly on the Volkov payroll. He produced documentation and alibis and reasonable doubt with the ease of someone who'd navigated these situations many times before. And within 2 hours, Ryan was being escorted out by his own colleagues, while Dante's lawyers promised legal consequences if he continued to harass me or spread unsubstantiated allegations about their client's involvement in what was clearly just an unfortunate missing persons case that had no evidence connecting it to anyone in the room. I watched the whole thing unfold with a strange detachment, seeing clearly how power really worked in the world, how money and connections and the willingness to use both ruthlessly could bend institutions that were supposed to be impartial arbiters of justice. And I understood that I'd moved permanently into a reality where normal rules didn't apply, and consequences could be managed or eliminated if you had the right resources and the stomach to deploy them without hesitation or remorse. But Ryan wasn't finished, wasn't satisfied with being warned off, and threatened with legal action. And 3 days later, when I was being driven back to the penthouse after another day at the gallery, our car was forced off the road by a vehicle that had been following us for blocks, and before my security could react properly, I was being dragged from the back seat by Ryan, who had clearly decided that if the legal system wouldn't give him justice, then he'd take it himself by making me pay for what he believed I'd done to his brother. The kidnapping was amateur and desperate and doomed to fail because Dante's organization was too well connected and too technologically sophisticated to lose track of me for long. But the hours I spent zip-tied to a chair in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, while Ryan ranted about family and justice, and how I was a murderous whore who'd manipulated a crime boss into killing an innocent man, were genuinely terrifying in ways that brought back every trauma Marcus had inflicted, every moment of helplessness and fear I'd experienced during our relationship. Ryan hit me, not with Marcus's practiced cruelty, but with righteous fury that somehow made it worse because he genuinely believed he was the hero in this story, that he was avenging his brother and punishing evil, and he couldn't or wouldn't see that Marcus had been a monster who'd hurt me systematically for 2 years, that the bruises Ryan was adding to my face were nothing compared to the damage his brother had done to my psyche and self-worth. And I realized with bitter clarity that this was what happened when you told your story to people who'd already decided you were the villain. They couldn't hear the truth through their preconceived narrative, couldn't accept that sometimes the person who disappeared was the actual threat, and their disappearance was the only thing standing between their victim and eventual murder. When Dante found me, and I'd never doubted he would find me because that kind of obsessive protection meant he'd burn the entire city down before he'd accept losing me, the violence of the rescue was absolutely apocalyptic, and I watched through swelling eyes as he personally beat Ryan with methodical brutality that went beyond tactical necessity into something darker and more personal. And I should have looked away or felt horror at witnessing that level of savagery, but instead, I felt vindicated and protected and grimly satisfied because Ryan had put his hands on me, and in Dante's world that transgressed the one absolute rule that carried the harshest penalties. The other men in Dante's team, Victor and Alexei and several others whose names I'd learned over the past weeks, stood back and let their boss work out his rage with fists and boots, and eventually a gun that he pressed to Ryan's temple while asking me in a voice rough with fury whether I wanted him to pull the trigger or if I preferred a more creative solution to this problem. I stared at Ryan's bloody face, seeing Marcus in his features and remembering every time Marcus had hit me and apologized and promised to change and then done it again. And I thought about how Ryan had tracked me down and kidnapped me and beaten me because he'd decided his brother's version of events was more credible than my lived experience of abuse. And when I opened my mouth, I surprised myself by saying clearly, and without hesitation, that I didn't want him dead. Not because he deserved mercy, but because I didn't want his death on my conscience the way Marcus's was, didn't want to add another body to the pile of consequences stemming from that 3 a.m. phone call, and I wanted him to live with the knowledge that he'd attacked someone under Volkov protection, and survived only because his victim had been merciful in ways his brother never was. Dante looked at me for a long moment, something shifting in his expression that might have been respect, or admiration, or recognition that I was stronger than either of us had given me credit for. And then he lowered the gun and issued orders in Russian that resulted in Ryan being dragged away to whatever fate Dante had decided was appropriate for someone who'd transgressed but been granted life by their victim's intervention. And I knew without asking that Ryan would disappear from the city if he was smart, and would suffer severely if he wasn't. But either way, he wouldn't be coming after me again, because everyone in Dante's world now understood that I wasn't just protected. I was valued enough that attempts to harm me triggered responses severe enough to serve as warnings to anyone else who might consider testing those boundaries. In the aftermath, when Dante carried me out of that warehouse just like he'd carried me out of my apartment 6 weeks ago, except this time, I was both more damaged and somehow stronger, more clear-eyed about exactly what I'd chosen, and what it cost, and why I was willing to pay that price. I made my decision with absolute certainty that felt like finally owning my choices, rather than having them made for me by fear or conditioning or other people's expectations about how victims should behave or what recovery should look like. "Marry me," Dante said when we were back at the penthouse and I'd been examined by his private doctor, and my injuries had been treated, and we were alone in his bathroom, where he was carefully washing blood, Ryan's and mine mixed together, from my hair with a tenderness that never failed to surprise me coming from hands capable of such violence. It wasn't really a question despite the phrasing, more like a statement of intention that he was giving me the opportunity to agree with. But the thing was that I did agree. Had already decided somewhere between being kidnapped and rescued that I wasn't leaving this world or this man, that whatever moral lines I'd crossed or compromises I'd made were permanent, and I could either accept that and build something real within those parameters, or spend the rest of my life pretending I was someone I'd stopped being the moment I'd called him crying at 3 a.m. "Yes," I said simply, and I watched in the bathroom mirror as satisfaction and possessive joy transformed his face into something almost vulnerable. And he pulled a ring from his pocket, emerald surrounded by diamonds, because he'd somehow known or remembered that emeralds were my favorite stone, and slid it onto my finger while promising me in English and Russian that everything he was, everything he controlled, everything he could become existed to keep me safe. And I believed him because he'd proven it repeatedly through actions that spoke louder than any words could about the depth of his obsessive protection and the price he was willing to extract from anyone who threatened what he'd claimed as his. The wedding happened 3 weeks later in a Russian Orthodox church, filled with dangerous, beautiful people who comprised Dante's world, and I wore white despite everything that had happened, because Dante insisted I deserved the symbolism and the traditional celebration, even though we both knew I was anything but innocent, after everything I'd accepted and sanctioned and chosen to overlook in pursuit of safety and agency, and a love that was probably unhealthy by conventional standards, but felt more real and honest than anything I'd experienced in my previous attempts at normal relationships. Standing at the altar with Dante's hand gripping mine like he was afraid I'd disappear and promising forever to a man who'd killed for me and would kill again without hesitation if circumstances demanded it, I understood that my 3 a.m. phone call hadn't just cost someone their life. It had bought me a dangerous, obsessive, utterly consuming love that had redefined everything I thought I knew about strength and protection, and whether safety always had to come wrapped in conventional morality and socially acceptable choices. And as I said my vows in front of people who operated in shadows and understood that power came from the willingness to deploy violence strategically, I accepted that I'd become someone new, someone harder and more clear-headed about the darkness that lived in human hearts, and the reality that sometimes the only way to stop monsters was to have bigger monsters willing to protect you from them. And maybe that made me complicit, or damaged, or morally compromised. But it also made me alive and whole and finally free from the fear that had defined my existence for so long. And that freedom was worth every drop of blood that had been spilled to purchase it. Worth every moral line I'd crossed. Worth the knowledge that I'd traded one kind of danger for another, except this danger loved me with an intensity that burned away everything else. And as Dante kissed me to seal our vows, and his people celebrated around us with vodka and music, and the kind of joy that people who live close to violence know how to embrace with particular fierceness, I realized that my tears at 3 a.m. hadn't just changed my life. They'd ended one version of me and birthed another, and this new version understood that love and violence could coexist, that protection sometimes required brutality, and that choosing your own darkness was infinitely preferable to having darkness chosen for you by someone who wanted to diminish rather than elevate you. And I would spend the rest of my life navigating the complicated reality of being Dante Volkov's wife, protected and possessed and valued in ways that defied easy categorization. But at least I'd be navigating it as myself, whole and unafraid, finally strong enough to exist in a world that had tried repeatedly to break me. And that strength, purchased at such terrible cost, felt like the most honest thing I'd ever claimed as my own.